The women lined up outside a white-painted building, their bare feet cold against concrete. Inside, American doctors waited with stethoscopes and clipboards, their sleeves rolled to their elbows. A Japanese-American translator stood beside them, a Nisei woman from California whose English carried no trace of accent. She spoke gently, explaining what would happen, but her presence only deepened the strangeness. Here was a woman who looked like them, yet belonged entirely to America. One by one the prisoners entered. The nurse from Saipan went first. She had treated hundreds of wounded soldiers in field hospitals, her hands steady even when artillery shook the walls. But now, stepping before the American doctor, a man with gray temples and kind eyes, she felt her composure crack. He gestured for her to sit. His examination was thorough but respectful, his touch clinical, impersonal. When he found the scar on her shoulder from shrapnel, he paused. "Battle wound?" he asked through the translator. She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. He made a note, then reached for a jar of ointment. "This will help it heal properly." The kindness undid her. She had expected inspection like livestock, degradation, perhaps worse. Instead, she received treatment better than what her own army had provided. When she left the room, her hands trembled. The younger clerk asked if she was all right. The nurse could only shake her head, words failing. That night, lying in her bunk, she stared at the ceiling and thought of the military hospital on Saipan. She remembered the screams of dying men, the smell of gangrene, the way supplies dwindled until they were reusing bandages soaked in blood. She remembered the American planes overhead, their engines roaring like thunder, dropping bombs that turned the world to fire. She had hated those planes with every fiber of her being. Yet now, in the belly of that same enemy nation, she had been given ointment for a wound 2 years old. The contradiction was suffocating. The rhythm of captivity. Days became weeks. The camp developed its own cadence. Morning bells at 6. Breakfast lines forming in orderly queues. Roll call conducted with efficiency but without malice. Work details assigned. Laundry, kitchen help, gardening. The women moved through their tasks quietly, watching everything, recording each detail in their minds as if gathering evidence for a trial that would never come. The Americans seemed almost careless in their abundance. Food arrived on trucks daily, crates of vegetables, sacks of flour, cuts of meat wrapped in paper. The women had grown up with rationing, with hunger gnawing constantly at the edges of consciousness. Even before the war, Japan had struggled to feed itself, importing rice, tightening belts during lean harvests. But here, waste bins overflowed with scraps that would have fed families. One afternoon, a young woman named Keiko was assigned to kitchen duty. She watched as an American cook cracked a dozen eggs into a bowl without counting, without hesitation, as if eggs were infinite. In Tokyo, a single egg had been a luxury. Her mother would divide one among 4 children, each receiving a sliver. Now she stood in an enemy camp, staring at abundance that seemed almost obscene. The cook noticed her expression and grinned. "You want to help?" She didn't understand his words, but his gesture was clear. He handed her a whisk. She took it, her movements stiff, uncertain. He showed her how to beat the eggs, his demonstration exaggerated and friendly, as if teaching a younger sister. When the eggs foamed golden, he gave her a thumbs up. That simple gesture, approval from an enemy, left her hollow with confusion. The tall men. The guards rotated shifts, but certain faces became familiar. There was Miller, a farm boy from Nebraska with shoulders like barn doors and a laugh that carried across the compound. There was Torres, dark-eyed and quiet, who played guitar in the evenings, his fingers coaxing melodies that drifted through the barracks like smoke. There was Jackson, rail-thin and nervous, who stammered when he spoke, and seemed almost as frightened of the prisoners as they were of him. The women watched them with a fascination they barely admitted. In Japanese propaganda films, American soldiers had been portrayed as grotesque, fanged, drooling, barely human. But these men moved with grace, their bodies athletic from lives spent playing baseball, hauling hay, working construction. They stood impossibly tall, their uniforms crisp, their boots polished to mirrors. Some had freckles dusting their noses. Others had eyes the color of ocean water, startling and clear. The younger women whispered about them after lights out. Miller lifted an entire crate today, alone. Torres has the most beautiful hands. Jackson smiles like a boy, not a soldier. The older women shushed them, scandalized. But even they could not deny the strangeness of it. These were the monsters of their nightmares, the demons who had burned their cities and killed their brothers. Yet up close they were just boys far from home, playing cards between shifts, writing letters to mothers, sharing cigarettes with the same casual generosity they might show friends. One evening, the nurse from Saipan stood near the fence watching the guards change shifts. Miller approached, his rifle slung over one shoulder, a pack of Lucky Strikes in his hand. He offered her one without speaking, his gesture simple, unthreatening. She hesitated, then accepted. He lit it for her with a match struck against his boot. They stood in silence, smoke curling between them. In that moment, she saw not a demon, but a tired young man whose eyes carried the same exhaustion she felt. He couldn't have been older than 23, the same age as her younger brother, who had died at Guadalcanal. When Miller walked away, she remained at the fence, the cigarette burning down to her fingers. The Americans provided paper and pens. "You can write to your families," the translator explained. "The Red Cross will forward them." The women stared at the blank pages, overwhelmed. Some wept. Others sat frozen, unable to form words. What could they possibly say? How could they explain that they were prisoners in America, yet treated better than they had been in their own country's service? How could they describe the tall guards who offered cigarettes and the meals that filled their bellies for the first time in years? And beneath those questions lurked another, darker truth. The Japanese government had never acknowledged their existence. Their families believed them dead. No official record admitted that Japanese soldiers or nurses could surrender. To write home would be to reveal themselves as ghosts, as disgraces who had violated the Senjin-kun code that demanded death before capture. Most letters remained unwritten, but a few women tried. The clerk Keiko wrote to her mother in careful characters, "I am alive. I am safe. Please do not worry. The place where I am is not what we were told. I am learning that truth is more complicated than we believed." She folded the letter carefully, knowing it might never arrive, knowing that even if it did, her mother might burn it rather than admit her daughter had surrendered. But she gave it to the Red Cross representative anyway, a small act of defiance against the lies that had shaped her entire life. Sunday afternoons the guards played baseball. A diamond was marked in the dirt beyond the barracks, bases made from sandbags, a backstop cobbled from chicken wire. The Americans arrived in groups, shedding their uniform shirts, their undershirts white against sun-browned skin. They chose teams with easy camaraderie, arguing playfully over positions. The women watched from the barracks windows. At first they observed out of boredom, seeking distraction from the weight of captivity. But gradually, the game revealed something profound. These men, who carried rifles and guarded prisoners, played with the unself-conscious joy of children. They shouted encouragement, groaned at bad pitches, dove for catches with bodies that seemed unbreakable. When someone hit a home run, the entire team erupted, slapping backs, laughing until they doubled over. The women had never seen soldiers behave this way. Japanese troops moved with rigid discipline, every action measured, every emotion suppressed. Joy was weakness, laughter was frivolity. To be a soldier meant to accept death as inevitable and duty as absolute. But these Americans seemed to carry war lightly, as if it were a job rather than a sacred calling. They played baseball on their days off. They joked. They lived. Miller hit a line drive that sailed past the outfielders. He rounded the bases with exaggerated slowness, grinning as his teammates yelled at him to hurry. When he slid into home, unnecessarily, theatrically, the others tackled him in a pile of laughing bodies. Watching from her window, the nurse from Saipan felt something twist inside her. This was the nation that had defeated Japan, not through cruelty or fanaticism, but through strength so complete it could afford mercy, through abundance so vast it could feed prisoners, through confidence so deep it could play games while guarding the conquered. America's power, she realized, was not in brutality. It was in this, the ability to fight a war and still remain human. The Geneva Convention mandated that prisoners of war could work but must be paid. The women were assigned tasks, sewing uniforms, tending vegetable gardens, assisting in the camp laundry. For each day's labor, they received small sums in scrip, camp currency that could be exchanged for extras, soap, writing paper, small luxuries. The concept baffled them. In Japan, duty required no reward. Service to the emperor was its own compensation. To be paid for work, even as prisoners, seemed to invert the natural order. Keiko worked in the laundry, her hands red from hot water and lye soap. Beside her, an older woman named Sachiko scrubbed fatigues with methodical precision. They worked in silence, the only sound the slosh of water and the rhythmic scrape of fabric against washboards. One afternoon, Torres arrived with a basket of soiled uniforms. He set it down gently, nodding his thanks. Before leaving, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar, a Hershey's, the wrapper brown and simple. He held it out to Keiko. She froze, staring at it. Chocolate. She had not tasted chocolate since before the war, when her father brought home a small piece from a business trip to Manchuria. She remembered its sweetness, rich and almost painful in its intensity. Torres gestured again, encouraging. When she finally took it, her hands trembled. He smiled, that American smile, open and easy, and walked away. Keiko stood clutching the chocolate bar, its weight almost unbearable. Sachiko watched her with dark eyes. "Do not become soft," the older woman murmured. "They are still the enemy." But that night, when Keiko broke the chocolate into pieces and shared it with the women in her barracks, no one refused. They ate in silence, letting the sweetness dissolve on their tongues, each bite a betrayal of everything they had been taught. And with each bite, the walls of propaganda crumbled a little more. The camp hospital stood at the center of the compound, its walls painted white, its windows large and clean. When one of the women, a young nurse named Yuki, developed a fever, she was taken there immediately. The American doctor examined her with the same thoroughness he would give his own troops. He diagnosed pneumonia, administered sulfa drugs, and monitored her for 3 days until the fever broke. Yuki had expected to be left to recover or die on her own. In the field hospitals of Saipan, medicine had run out months before the end. Soldiers died of infections that penicillin could have cured in days. Nurses did their best with boiled rags and prayers, but here in the enemy's land she was given medicine that cost more than a month's wages in Japan. She was given a clean bed, fresh water, and broth when she could swallow. The American nurses, women in starched white uniforms, checked on her hourly, their touch gentle, professional. When she recovered, she wept. Not from relief, but from the crushing realization that her own country had never valued her this way. She had served the emperor with total devotion, had risked her life in field hospitals under bombardment, had watched friends die. Yet Japan had given her nothing but propaganda and rice rations that shrank every month. America, her enemy, had saved her life with medicine and kindness. The contradiction was annihilating. Intelligence officers arrived periodically, clipboard in hand, questions prepared. The women were taken one by one to a small office where a Japanese-American translator sat beside a serious-looking officer. The questions were methodical. Where were you captured? What was your unit? What did you see before surrender? To the officer's surprise, many women answered freely. The Senjin-kun Code taught that surrender severed all bonds with Japan. If they were dead to their country, then they owed it nothing. And the Americans, with their patient questioning and careful note-taking, made cooperation feel almost easy. They did not shout, they did not threaten. They simply listened, as if the women's experiences mattered. The nurse from Saipan sat across from an officer named Lieutenant Harris. He was young, with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved constantly, adjusting papers, clicking his pen. The translator, a Nisei woman named Dorothy, spoke with warmth that disarmed defenses. "We're not here to punish you," Harris said through Dorothy. "We're just trying to understand what happened." So the nurse told him. She described the hospital on Saipan, the way supplies vanished, the way officers ordered civilian suicides rather than surrender. She told him about the cliffs where mothers jumped with babies in their arms, choosing death over capture by the American beasts. She told him about the propaganda broadcasts that promised torture and rape if they fell into enemy hands. Harris listened without interrupting, his expression grave. When she finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry you were taught to fear us that way." The apology stunned her into silence. No one had ever apologized for her suffering. Not her commanding officers, not the government officials who sent her to Saipan, not the propagandists who filled her mind with lies. But this American lieutenant, whose bombers had destroyed her hospital, whose troops had conquered her island, sat before her and offered regret. She left the interrogation room with her worldview in pieces. News traveled slowly through the camps, but when it arrived, it hit like artillery. In August 1944, at a POW camp in Cowra, Australia, Japanese prisoners had attempted a mass breakout. Over 1,000 men armed with improvised weapons had charged the fences in a suicidal assault. The result was catastrophic. 234 Japanese dead, 108 wounded, 4 Australian guards killed. The women heard the story from guards who spoke of it in hushed tones, from newspapers that circulated through the camp, from the translator who tried to explain why it mattered. For the American officers, Cowra was a warning. It reminded them that surrender did not equal submission, that the Japanese code of honor could turn even captivity into a battlefield. For the women, it was something else entirely. It was proof of how deep the indoctrination ran, how thoroughly their people had internalized the belief that death was preferable to the shame of captivity. Those men at Cowra had chosen to die rather than live as prisoners. They had believed until the very end that the enemy was monstrous. But the women now knew differently. They had lived among the monsters and found them disturbingly human. They had been fed and sheltered and treated with a decency that contradicted every warning. The men at Cowra had died for a lie, and that made their deaths almost unbearable to contemplate. One night, lying in her bunk, Keiko whispered to the darkness, "They died believing what we were taught. But we know the truth now. Does that make us traitors or cowards?" No one answered. The question hung in the air like smoke, choking and inescapable. Summer arrived, bringing heat that made the barracks stifling. One afternoon, a truck pulled into the compound, its cargo covered with canvas. Guards unloaded crates with unusual care, and word spread quickly through the women's quarters. Ice cream. The concept seemed surreal. Ice cream. In a prison camp. During a war that had just ended with atomic fire and unconditional surrender. The Americans set up tables in the shade, distributing small cups of vanilla ice cream with wooden spoons. They gestured for the women to line up, their expressions almost sheepish, as if embarrassed by the luxury. The women approached slowly, disbelieving. When Keiko received her cup, she stared at it for a long moment. The ice cream was already beginning to melt in the heat, white cream puddling at the bottom. She lifted the wooden spoon, tasted it, and felt tears sting her eyes. It was cold, sweet, perfect. Around her, other women reacted similarly. Some laughed, some wept. One older woman simply stood motionless, the ice cream melting forgotten in her hands. Miller, watching from nearby, seemed confused by their reactions. To him, ice cream was ordinary, a treat given to troops to boost morale. But to these women, it was evidence of something incomprehensible. An enemy so wealthy, so powerful, that it could afford to give prisoners ice cream. That night, Sachiko, the older woman who had warned against going soft, sat on her bunk and spoke into the darkness. "They gave us ice cream," she said, her voice hollow. "We were losing the war and starving, and they were making ice cream for prisoners." The words settled over the barracks like a shroud. In that moment, the full scale of Japan's defeat became clear. They had not lost to a brutal enemy. They had lost to a nation with resources so vast, power so complete, that generosity cost them nothing. The Red Cross maintained records. They followed protocols. They attempted to notify families. But for the women in the camp, no letters arrived. The Japanese government refused to acknowledge that any of its citizens had surrendered. Families received notifications of death, killed in action, lost at sea, missing, presumed dead. The fiction was maintained with bureaucratic precision. To admit that Japanese soldiers, nurses, and civilians could be taken alive would undermine the entire mythology of Yamato Damashi, the warrior spirit that supposedly made surrender unthinkable, so the women existed in a void. Alive, but officially dead. Prisoners, but ghosts. They wrote letters that were never answered, asked questions that met only silence. The isolation was its own form of torture, perhaps worse than physical cruelty. To be erased so completely, to know your family mourned you while you breathed, was a special kind of anguish. One woman, a former schoolteacher named Hana, stopped eating. She sat at meals with her tray untouched, staring at nothing. The camp doctor examined her, found no physical illness, and prescribed rest. But rest did nothing for a wound that had no body. Hana was dying of erasure, of being unmade by her own government's lies. The nurse from Saipan sat with her one evening, holding her hand. "They have forgotten us," Hana whispered. "To Japan we do not exist." "Then we exist for ourselves," the nurse replied, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath. "We exist here, now, in this moment. That is enough." It was a small defiance, but it mattered. They would survive not for Japan, not for honor, but for the simple, stubborn fact of being alive. They would prove, if only to themselves, that existence was not shameful. October arrived with cooler air and golden leaves. The war had been over for 2 months. Repatriation plans were being discussed, ships prepared, routes calculated. The women knew their time in America was finite, that soon they would return to a Japan they no longer recognized. But before that return, something shifted. It happened during a conversation between the nurse from Saipan and Lieutenant Harris. He had called her in for a final interview, tying up loose ends in his reports. They sat across from each other, Dorothy translating between them, the familiar ritual of question and answer. But this time the nurse had questions of her own. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady. "Why did you treat us this way?" Harris looked up from his clipboard, surprised. "I don't understand." "We are your enemy. You defeated us. You could have done anything. Why give us food, medicine, kindness?" Harris considered the question carefully. When he spoke, his words were measured. "Because that's who we are," he said, "or who we try to be." The war was about defending freedom and decency. If we won by becoming cruel, then we would have lost something more important than battles. Dorothy translated, and the nurse sat in silence, absorbing the words. Then she asked the question that had haunted her since the day she arrived. "If you are not monsters, then what are you?" Harris smiled sadly. "Just people. Trying to do the right thing, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding." That answer, simple and devastating, broke something open inside her. Because if the Americans were just people, flawed, uncertain, trying their best, then what did that make the Japanese who had fought them? What did it make the propaganda that had painted them as demons? What did it make the war itself? She left the interrogation room and walked to the fence, staring through the wire at the American fields beyond. The sky was vast and blue, unmarred by the smoke of burning cities. Birds called from the trees. Somewhere in the distance she could hear the guards playing baseball, their laughter carrying on the wind. And she understood finally the true nature of her captivity. The fences were real, yes. The guards carried rifles. She was not free to leave. But the greater prison had been in her mind. The walls built by years of propaganda, by lies told so often they became truth, by fear that had shaped every thought. America had not freed her from Japan. America had freed her from the lies about America. That realization was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. One evening, the Americans set up a projector in the mess hall. They announced a film showing, voluntary attendance, no pressure. The women arrived out of curiosity, settling onto wooden benches as the lights dimmed and a white sheet stretched across the wall flickered to life. The film was American newsreel footage from the war. It showed battles in the Pacific, ships burning at Pearl Harbor, Marines waiting ashore at Tarawa, planes screaming through flak-filled skies. The narrator's voice was triumphant, patriotic, describing American victories with dramatic flair. But interspersed with the battle footage were scenes that stunned the women into silence. American factories, vast beyond imagination, producing tanks, planes, ships at impossible speed. Women working assembly lines, their hair tied back, their hands swift and sure. Farms stretching to the horizon, mechanized harvesters cutting wheat in golden waves, cities unscathed by bombing, their streets full of cars, their shops full of goods. And then, most devastating of all, footage of Japanese cities after the firebombings. Tokyo in ruins, Nagasaki's mushroom cloud, Hiroshima's aftermath, buildings reduced to shadows and ash. The women watched their homeland destroyed in flickering black and white, and some turned away, unable to bear it. When the film ended and the lights came on, no one spoke. They filed out slowly, their faces pale, their thoughts in turmoil. They had known Japan lost. They had known their cities burned. But seeing it in film, presented as history already documented and judged, made the defeat visceral in a new way. Keiko walked to her barracks in a daze. She thought of her family's house in Osaka, the garden her father had tended, the room where she had slept as a child. Were they ash now? Had her family survived? She had no way to know. That night, lying in the darkness, she whispered to Sachiko, "We lost because we were always going to lose. We never had a chance." Sachiko's reply came quiet and bitter. "We lost because we were lied to. About everything." Life in the camp developed its own small comforts. Morning tea, weak but hot, sipped while watching sunrise through the barracks windows. The routine of work, hands busy with familiar tasks. Evening walks along the fence line, the same path worn smooth by daily footsteps. Conversations that grew deeper as the weeks passed, women sharing memories they had kept locked inside. The guards, too, became part of the rhythm. Miller would whistle the same tune every morning, some American song the women didn't know but came to recognize. Torres played guitar in the evenings, his melodies drifting through the camp. Jackson, despite his nervousness, developed a routine of checking the vegetable garden daily, proud of the tomatoes growing fat on their vines. Small interactions accumulated into something almost like normalcy. A nod of greeting between guard and prisoner, a shared smile when rain arrived after weeks of heat, the passing of a tool, a gesture of thanks, small courtesies that bridged the gap between captor and captive. One afternoon, Yuki, the nurse who had recovered from pneumonia, was working in the garden when Torres approached. He gestured to the tomato plants, heavy with fruit, and mimed picking one. She understood and selected a large tomato, handing it to him. He bit into it immediately, juice running down his chin, and grinned at her with such genuine pleasure that she laughed despite herself. It was the first time she had laughed since capture. The sound startled her, foreign and bright. Torres laughed too, pleased to have amused her, and walked away, still eating the tomato. Such moments were small, almost inconsequential. But they mattered. They were proof that humanity could persist even here, even now, even between people who had been taught to see each other as monsters. The younger women spoke of it in whispers, ashamed but unable to stop. The guards were handsome. Not all of them, but many. And the contrast with the Japanese men they had known, undernourished, exhausted by war, was stark and undeniable. Miller with his broad shoulders and easy grin, Torres with his dark eyes and skilled hands. Even nervous Jackson, with his boyish face and earnest manner, had a certain appeal. The women tried to suppress these thoughts, knowing they were dangerous. To find the enemy attractive felt like betrayal, like one more way they were failing their country. But the thoughts persisted, stubborn and unwelcome. Keiko admitted it one night, her voice barely audible. "I think Miller is beautiful." The confession hung in the darkness. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Sachiko, the older woman who had warned against softness, replied with unexpected gentleness. "Beauty is not political. You can notice it without betraying anyone." But even as she said it, they all knew it wasn't quite true. Because noticing beauty in the enemy, finding them admirable rather than monstrous, was itself a political act. It meant the propaganda had failed. It meant the walls between us and them had begun to crumble. And once those walls fell, what remained? November brought cold winds and the first real news of repatriation. Ships were being prepared, routes established. The women would return to Japan in waves, transported back across the Pacific to a homeland that might not recognize them. The American officers handled the logistics with characteristic efficiency, creating lists, checking documentation, and arranging provisions for the journey. But the women felt nothing like relief. What awaited them in Japan? Their families believed them dead. Their government denied they existed. They would return as ghosts, as disgraces who had violated the sacred code by surrendering. Some whispered of suicide, of ending things before the shame of return. Others spoke of disappearing, starting over with new names, new lives. The nurse from Saipan sat with Lieutenant Harris one final time. "What will you do when you go home?" he asked. She looked at her hands, scarred from years of medical work, calloused from labor in the camp. "I do not know if I have a home anymore." Harris nodded slowly. "The war changed everyone. You're not the only one who feels lost." "But you won," she said. "Your country still stands. Your cities are whole. You return as heroes." "Maybe," Harris replied. "But we saw things too. Did things. Those don't disappear just because we won." It was the first time she had considered that the victors might also carry scars, that victory might not erase all wounds. The thought was strangely comforting, the idea that suffering was universal, that even the strong knew pain. "Will you remember us?" she asked. Harris met her eyes. "Yes. I don't think I could forget even if I tried." December arrived with snow, light and beautiful, coating the camp in silence. The women had never seen snow like this, soft, clean, accumulating in drifts that transformed the landscape into something from a dream. They stood at the windows, watching it fall, marveling at this final gift from America. Miller organized a snowball fight among the guards, their laughter echoing across the compound. Without thinking, Jackson tossed a snowball toward the women's barracks. It landed softly in the snow, an invitation. For a moment, no one moved. Then Keiko, with a recklessness born of knowing time was short, formed a snowball and threw it back. It hit Jackson square in the chest, and his face registered comic shock before breaking into a grin. What followed was brief, chaotic, joyful. Women and guards throwing snow, laughing, slipping on ice, becoming for just a few minutes not prisoners and captors but simply people playing in winter's first snow. When it ended, everyone returned to their proper places, the boundaries reasserting themselves. But something had shifted. They had played together. They had shared joy. That night, lying in her bunk, the nurse from Saipan thought about how history would record this moment. Would anyone believe that Japanese prisoners and American guards had played in the snow? Would anyone understand how that simple game had mattered more than 1,000 speeches about victory and defeat? She doubted it. Some truths were too small, too human to survive the grand narratives of war. The final night before departure, the Americans prepared a feast. Turkey, roasted golden, mashed potatoes heaped in serving bowls, gravy, vegetables, bread still warm from the oven, and dessert, pie, 3 kinds, the crusts perfect and flaky. It was, they explained, a traditional American meal. Thanksgiving had passed, but they wanted the women to experience it before leaving. The women sat at long tables in the mess hall, plates loaded with food that seemed impossible even now, after months of such treatment. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, knowing this would be their last meal in America, their last taste of this strange abundance. Torres played guitar in the corner, soft melodies that needed no translation. Miller stood near the door, watching with an expression the women couldn't quite read, sadness, maybe, or regret. Harris moved between tables, ensuring everyone had enough, his officer's efficiency softened by genuine care. When the meal ended, the translator stood to speak. "The officers wanted me to tell you something," Dorothy said, her voice carrying through the quiet hall. "They know you're going home to uncertainty. They know it won't be easy, But they want you to know that you survived, that you're going home alive, and that matters." The words were simple, almost inadequate, but they landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the assembled women. Sachiko rose suddenly, her movements stiff with emotion. She bowed, deep, formal, a bow of respect and gratitude. One by one, the other women stood and bowed as well. The Americans didn't know how to respond at first. Then, clumsily but sincerely, they bowed in return. It was an exchange of recognition, of shared humanity acknowledged across the gulf of war and defeat and victory. No words could have carried more weight. Morning came cold and gray, the sky heavy with unshed snow. Trucks waited to transport the women to the docks, where ships would carry them across the Pacific. They gathered their few possessions, satchels worn from travel, letters that had never been sent, small gifts the guards had given them, a chocolate bar, a photograph, a flower pressed between pages. The guards assembled to see them off, their expressions solemn. No one spoke much. What was there to say? Miller approached Keiko one final time, holding something in his hand, a small American flag, worn and faded. He offered it to her awkwardly. "To remember," he said through Dorothy's translation, "that we weren't all bad." Keiko took it, her throat tight. "I will remember," she whispered. "Everything." The nurse from Saipan sought out Lieutenant Harris. They stood facing each other, two people whose paths should never have crossed, bound together by the strange alchemy of war and its aftermath. "Thank you," she said, the English words careful but clear, "for seeing us as human." Harris nodded, his eyes bright. "Thank you for surviving, for going home, for carrying this story forward." As the women climbed into the trucks, Torres played one last song on his guitar, something slow and melancholy, a farewell rendered in melody. The guards stood at attention, a final salute to prisoners who had become somehow more than enemies. The trucks pulled away and the camp disappeared behind them. The ship that carried them back across the Pacific was not the same one that had brought them to America. This vessel was Japanese, reclaimed from the war effort, its decks crowded with returning soldiers and civilians. The women stood among hundreds of others, all making the same journey toward an uncertain future. The ocean was gray and cold, nothing like the triumphant voyages of earlier years when Japanese expansion had seemed limitless. Now they sailed as the defeated, returning to a homeland broken and occupied by the very forces that had treated them with such unexpected kindness. On deck, the women gathered in small groups, speaking quietly. "What will we tell them?" Yuki asked. "About America?" "The truth," the nurse from Saipan replied. "That we were lied to. That the enemy was not monstrous. That we were treated with dignity." "They will not believe us," Sachiko said. "They will think we were brainwashed, turned against our own people." "Perhaps," the nurse agreed. "But we will know. We will carry the truth even if no one wants to hear it." As Japan's coastline appeared on the horizon, a gray smudge that grew more defined with each passing hour, the women felt something shift inside them. They were returning, yes, but not as the same people who had left. They had seen the enemy's face and found it human. They had tasted abundance and understood the true scale of Japan's defeat. They had been shown mercy when they expected cruelty, and that mercy had broken the propaganda's hold on their minds. The harbor at Yokohama was barely recognizable. Where once stood warehouses and customs buildings, now only rubble remained. The city beyond was a landscape of ash and twisted metal, buildings reduced to skeletal frames, streets lined with debris. The fire bombings had left almost nothing intact. As the women disembarked, they walked into a Japan that seemed to have died while they were gone. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, their faces hollow with hunger and exhaustion. Children picked through rubble seeking scraps. Women carried water in dented pots. The smell of ash and sewage hung heavy in the air. This was victory's opposite. This was what total defeat looked like. Keiko stumbled, overcome by the contrast. In America, she had seen cities alive with commerce, factories humming with production, people well-fed and clothed. Here, her own country resembled a graveyard. "This is what we returned to," she whispered. "While we ate ice cream and played in snow, this is what happened." The guilt was crushing, but beneath the guilt lay something else: anger. Anger at the leaders who had led Japan into a war it could never win. Anger at the propaganda that had hidden the truth. Anger at the lies that had cost so many lives. The women dispersed into the ruins, each seeking what remained of family and home. The nurse from Saipan found her family's house reduced to a foundation and charred timber. Her parents had survived and were living in a shelter made from scavenged materials. When she appeared at their door, her mother collapsed, sobbing. They had believed her dead for over a year. But when the nurse tried to tell them about America, about the camp, about the kindness she had experienced, her father raised a hand to stop her. "Do not speak of such things," he said, his voice hard. "You surrendered. You brought shame. We will not discuss it further." The silence fell like a curtain, absolute and final. Similar scenes played out across Japan. Women returned to families who could not accept that surrender had happened, who could not reconcile the propaganda with the truth their daughters carried. So the truth was buried, locked away, never spoken aloud. Keiko's family refused to acknowledge where she had been. When neighbors asked, her mother said Keiko had been ill, recovering in the countryside. The months in the American camp were erased, made fiction, as if they had never happened. Sachiko found her husband remarried, believing her dead. When she revealed herself, the shock and shame were so great that he asked her to leave, to let him maintain the lie that his first wife had died honorably. One by one, the women learned that their truth had no place in post-war Japan. The nation was busy rebuilding, accepting occupation, transforming itself. There was no room for stories that complicated the narrative of noble defeat and honorable suffering. So they remained silent. Decades passed. Japan rose from the ashes, transformed by American aid into an economic powerhouse. The women aged, their lives unfolding in the shadow of secrets they could not share. The nurse from Saipan became a doctor, her American medical experience unacknowledged, but invaluable. She treated patients with care learned in that camp hospital, techniques taught by the enemy doctor who had healed her wounds. Keiko opened a small shop, never married, never spoke of the war. But she kept Miller's flag hidden in a drawer, taking it out sometimes late at night when no one could see. Sachiko wrote memoirs that would never be published, filling notebooks with the truth she had witnessed. When she died, her children found the notebooks and burned them, ashamed of what they revealed. Only near the end of their lives did some women finally speak. In the 1980s, as Japan confronted its wartime past, a few surviving nurses agreed to interviews. They spoke haltingly, still afraid of judgment, about the camps in America where they had been held. "We expected torture," one said to a documentary filmmaker. "We received kindness." That was the most devastating thing. To realize everything we had been taught was a lie. Another, her hands shaking with age, described the tall American guards. They were just boys, like our brothers. They gave us chocolate and played baseball and treated us like we mattered. How could we have been so wrong about them? But these testimonies remained marginal, footnotes to larger histories. The story of female Japanese POWs in America did not fit neatly into narratives of heroism or victimhood. It complicated things, revealing truths too nuanced for simple telling. What remains of that brief time when Japanese women crossed the Pacific and met the enemy face to face? Only memories, fragmentary and contested. Only the knowledge, carried by a handful of aging women, that truth is more complex than propaganda admits, that enemies can be human, that mercy can be a greater weapon than cruelty. The camps are long gone, their barracks demolished, their fences removed. The ships that carried prisoners across the ocean have been scrapped. The guards, Miller, Torres, Jackson, Harris, lived their lives and died, most without ever speaking of the Japanese women they guarded for those brief months in 1945. But in the space between official histories, in the gaps where documented facts give way to human experience, the story persists. It persists in the question that haunted those women from the moment they set foot on American soil. If they are not monsters, then what are they? The answer, they learned, was devastating in its simplicity. They were people. Just people. Flawed, uncertain, doing their best in impossible circumstances. They were farmers and factory workers, baseball players and guitar players, boys far from home who happened to wear the uniform of victory. And in recognizing that humanity, the women had to confront a harder truth, that their own people, the leaders and propagandists who had shaped their beliefs, had lied. Not about small things, but about fundamental truths, about the nature of the enemy, about the war itself, about what honor and shame really meant. That realization, that moment when the propaganda collapsed and truth emerged, was its own kind of captivity's end. Not freedom from the camp, but freedom from the lies that had imprisoned their minds more thoroughly than any fence. The Pacific is vast, unchanged by the wars fought across its surface. The water that carried those women to America in August 1945 still rolls against both shores, connecting continents that once tried to destroy each other. The waves remember nothing. History moves on, indifferent to individual suffering. But somewhere in the space between remembering and forgetting, between official record and lived experience, the story of those women matters. It matters because it reveals a truth about war that simple victory and defeat narratives cannot capture, that the defeated are transformed not just by loss, but by the unexpected grace of the victor, that propaganda's power shatters when confronted with basic human decency, that captivity can liberate when it reveals the lies that truly imprison. The women who saw America's tall soldiers in abundance, who ate ice cream in prison camps and played in snow with their guards, who returned home carrying truths no one wanted to hear, they understood something profound. They understood that America's greatest weapon was not the atomic bomb or the industrial might or the military superiority. It was the capacity to win a war and still extend mercy. To defeat an enemy and then feed them, shelter them, treat them with dignity that their own nation had withheld. That mercy, more than any show of force, demonstrated the true nature of American power. It said, "We are strong enough to be kind. We can afford compassion. We win not by becoming monsters, but by remaining human." For women raised on propaganda that depicted Americans as devils, that truth was annihilating and liberating in equal measure. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson, that the most profound victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when enemy meets enemy and discovers only another human being, flawed and frightened and trying to survive. The camps are gone. The guards are dead. The women who lived this story have nearly all passed. But the question remains, echoing across decades, still unanswered, still urgent. If they are not monsters, then what are they? We are people, all of us, just people. And that simple truth, so hard to accept when nations wage war and propaganda paints the other side as inhuman, might be the only truth that really matters. The Pacific still separates continents. But for those women who crossed it twice, once in fear, once in bewilderment, the ocean became something else. A space where lies dissolved in salt water, where propaganda crumbled against the reality of kindness, where captivity became, strangely and unexpectedly, a form of freedom. They returned to Japan carrying that truth like contraband, dangerous and precious. Most kept it hidden their entire lives, buried deep where it could not disturb the comfortable narratives of defeat and occupation. But a few, near the end, spoke. And their words, haltingly shared, revealed a war more complex than history books admit. A war where the enemy offered chocolate and the victor showed mercy. Where tall men with kind eyes guarded prisoners not with cruelty but with something approaching respect. That war, the one lived in the gaps between battles, in the daily routines of prison camps, in the small kindnesses exchanged between supposed enemies. That war tells.